Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. If you've ever wandered through the dry wind of the Judean desert, with your feet crunching softly over gravel older than written language, you might know the cliffs don't speak. They stand, they wait, and every now and then they offer up something they've held for longer than memory. In the spring of 1952, one such silence broke just above the northwest edge of the Dead Sea. Not far from the ruins of Qumran, there is a dusty cleft in the rock, now known plainly as Cave 3. It looks like little more than a scar on the stone. But inside that unremarkable opening, a metal cylinder waited beneath centuries of dust and bat droppings. Not parchment, not leather, but copper, rolled tightly, darkened with age, and sealed like a whisper no one could quite hear. The scroll would become one of the most controversial and debated archaeological finds in modern history. Not for what it said, but for how it said it. Unlike the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which scholars read with magnifying glasses and gloves, the copper scroll was unreadable by touch. It could not be unrolled without breaking. Its creators had carved the letters into the metal itself, chiseling their secrets line by line, like someone who wanted their message to last forever, or to be buried for eternity. But how did it come to be found at all? The discovery was part accident, part curiosity, and part determination, a chain of quiet persistence that started not with a king or scholar, but with Bedouin shepherds chasing a goat through rock in 1947. A goat wandered into a cave, not this cave, not yet, and lead its shepherd to the first of what would become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. The text, unearthed from that moment, would grow to include over 900 documents, biblical, apocryphal, and administrative fragments tucked away in the caves around Qumran. Some were hidden in jars, some had crumbled to scraps. All were written in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, all dated from the last few centuries before and after the turn of the Common Era. Years passed. Teams of archaeologists and local Bedouins combed the area, one pocket of rock at a time. They knew the caves still held things. Some caves had been plundered already. Others seemed empty. And in March of 1952, Cave 3 looked unpromising, narrow, dusty, and littered with evidence that someone had likely disturbed it centuries ago. But a team led by archaeologist Henry de Contenson and local workers kept looking. They found pottery first, then fragments of scrolls, then behind a stone slab hidden in a crevice at the back of the cave, they found something odd. A bundle of oxidized copper rolled into two thick scrolls, greenish and heavy. Unlike anything else, the team didn't know what they were looking at. The copper was too brittle to open. When they tried to examine it by hand, flakes fell away like dead leaves. They sent it to Ammon, then to Manchester. Eventually, an engineer named John Allegro helped supervise a plan to cut it open. And this is how the copper scroll was first read, not with reverence, but with a circular saw. Over several painstaking days in 1955, technicians at Manchester College of Technology sliced the scroll into 23 narrow strips, carefully working around the engraved lines. It was a slow and brutal process, but it worked. What emerged was not a spiritual text, not a hymn, not a commentary, but something more curious. A list, a numbered list of 64 locations, each describing a place where treasure had been hidden, with specific amounts, units, and sometimes landmarks. The total treasure described would have amounted to more than 4,600 talents of gold and silver, spices, scrolls, and ritual objects, worth billions in modern terms. And yet, no mapped, no directions, just terse instructions like in the ruin. That is in the valley of Achor, under the steps, 40 cubits, a chest of silver and vessels. Or in the cistern that is in the courtyard of the tomb, in the third row, 600 gold bars. No names, no temple, no king, no priests. Just numbers, and dust, and silence. And so the mystery began. Where did the treasure come from? What buried it? Why on copper? Why in this cave? And perhaps most importantly, why could no one find it? Even after decades of searching, not a single item described in the copper scroll has been definitively located. Scholars are divided on whether the treasures ever existed, or if the scroll was symbolic, or something more. It's complicated. Some suggest it belonged to the Essenes, the Jewish sect thought to have lived in Qumran, ascetic scribes who prepared for the end of days. But the wealth described seems out of place for a community so famously austere. Others suggest it could be tied to the Second Temple in Jerusalem, hidden before Roman troops destroyed it in 70 CEs. Still others claim it's a red herring, a fantasy, or a forgery. But the copper is real. The carving is deliberate, and the scroll, like any other, was made not to be read in the moment, but to be read long after, carved into permanence, left in a cave, wrapped and hidden in the least perishable material they could find. Why? That's what makes this boring scroll so haunting. Not what it says, but the lengths someone went to so that you might someday read. It's so who buried $1 billion in treasure and didn't leave a way to find it. And if the treasure was real, did someone else find it before we did? You might expect that once the copper scroll was cut open and its 64 entries were laid bare, the world would have changed. After all, who finds a 2,000-year-old document listing hidden gold and silver, precise weights, locations, and chests, and doesn't immediately launch a frenzy of digging? But that's the quiet truth behind most of history when treasure is mentioned. The dust speaks louder. Once the scroll had been carefully sliced in Manchester and read, it was sent back to Jordan, where it was studied in the Jordan Archaeological Museum in Amman. The experts were puzzled. This was not a scroll in the literary sense. It didn't contain prayers or proverbs or laws. There were no parables, no moral guidance, no prophecy. It's just an itemized list, short phrases, many of them repetitive, and each one ending in a weight of silver or gold. Here is the beginning of one entry in the cave that is next to the spring of Bet Hakerem. Dig 7 cubits. There is hidden there a chest of gold and silver vessels. Another says, in the reservoir of Manos, in the northern canal, dig, and you will find 600 talents of silver. On and on it went. 47 of the entries specifically mentioned silver. 17 mentioned gold. A few mentioned ritual items, like vessels and incense, but not one of them mentioned a person. No king, no prophet, no priest, no scribe, no signature at the end, no date. To historians, it was as if a shopping list had floated up from the Bronze Age, a list that didn't tell you who wrote it, why it was written, or what it was for. This was unlike any other Dead Sea Scroll. The majority of scrolls found in Qumran were copied on parchment or papyrus. They included fragments of the Hebrew Bible, apocalyptic visions, community rules, and legal texts. They used poetic phrases, repeated formulas, theological commentary. They were clearly meant to be read aloud, studied, memorized. But the copper scroll was utterly different in both form and purpose. Its Hebrew was unusual, almost mechanical in style, with many proper nouns and place names that did not appear elsewhere in any known biblical or historical records. This made interpretation difficult. Were the locations real? Were they code names? Had the geography changed? Could a location like the cistern of the hill of Kalad even be identified in the modern desert? That question became the obsession of a few. Not many, but a few. One of them was a British scholar named John Marco Allegro. He believed the scroll was genuine and literal, not symbolic, not mythic. He believed it described real treasure, buried by a real group of people, possibly temple priests, in anticipation of a Roman invasion. Allegro was one of the first to suggest that the treasures had once belonged to the Second Temple in Jerusalem, the very center of Jewish worship. Famously looted and destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, could this list have been the final account of sacred wealth hidden in haste? Just before the legions arrived, others disagreed sharply. They argued the scroll had no connection to the temple. They pointed out that the Essenes, the sect believed to have lived in Qumran, were communal, poor, and unlikely to hoard massive wealth. Some scholars insisted that the scroll was not even written by the same community as the other Dead Sea Scrolls. Its metal, its script, its content, everything about it was out of place. The very choice of copper, its fact, was bizarre. Top rules expensive, difficult to inscribe, and impractical for storing documents. No other known ancient text of this type was ever carved into metal like this. The scroll wasn't designed for frequent reference. It wasn't designed for portability. It wasn't even designed to be opened easily. It was designed to last. That, perhaps, was the point. Unlike parchment, copper could not burn in a raid. It would not mold in a cave. It would not crumble in a scroll jar. It would wait, silently, permanently. Waiting for whom? Was it a final will and testament? A message for survivors? A riddle to be solved? And so, the academic debates began. Decades passed. Theories bloomed and withered. Some suggested the entire scroll was a hoax, an elaborate fiction, or perhaps an exaggerated description of symbolic treasure, never meant to be found. Others held that the treasure had indeed been retrieved long ago, perhaps by the Romans, or perhaps by those who hid it in the first place. Still others claimed that clues could be found in other ancient texts, including the Mishnah, the Book of Enoch, or obscure biblical references. Amateurs joined the conversation, too. Treasure hunters, code breakers, religious enthusiasts. Some claimed to have found matching locations, only to discover sand and stone. A few carried metal detectors into the hills. Others mapped the scroll's directions against ancient trade, routes, and priestly cities. But no treasure ever emerged. Instead, questions piled up. Why were so many entries vague, referencing landmarks that may never have had names on maps? Why was no one named in the entire document? Why was there no system of verification? No marks, seals, or signs that linked it to a known tradition? And if this was a real list, then why were none of the items marked as claimed or retrieved? Even among the faithful scholars, theories diverged. Some believed the scroll had been copied from an earlier list, possibly even generations older than the scroll itself. Others believed it was composed in the final days before Qumran was abandoned, a last act of defiance or hope. Few looked closer at the wording itself. They noticed that while the copper scroll's language was odd, it was extremely specific in its units of measure: talents, minas, cubits. This was not the style of mystical allegory. It was the language of inventory, of accounting, of management. The scroll, they argued, was not a legend. It was a ledger. But whose? And then came another layer of mystery. Many of the treasure locations referenced cisterns, reservoirs, and hiding places tied to water, perhaps suggesting underground channels or ruins, long buried by shifting desert. Were the treasures even accessible anymore? Or had they, like the scroll itself, become one with the rock? Still, the copper speaks. It remains today in Amman, Jordan, housed in a climate-controlled case. Visitors can view it behind glass. It no longer gleams, but its message is as clear as the day it was carved. 64 entries. dozens of measures of gold, in silver, in silence. And what of the people who wrote it? No signature, no seal, no claim, just the enduring echo of precision. That may be the most haunting part of all, not the value of the treasure, but the silence of the people who made it. They did not shout. They did not boast. They left no inscription for their own glory. They simply recorded what they had buried. So now we ask quietly, was it ever meant to be found? Or was the act of hiding it the last ritual of a world that knew it was vanishing? By now, you can picture it. A rolled sheet of copper, battered and brittle, covered in neat Hebrew letters, etched with care and strain, listing, line after line, unclaimed treasure, gold, silver, vessels, scrolls, cisterns, caves, units measured, in talents and minas, recorded with a bureaucratic rigidity that feels strangely modern, but none of it ever found. Not one chest, not one bar, not even a single cup. For more than 70 years since the scroll's rediscovery, there's been a peculiar silence surrounding its contents, as though the copper scroll was not meant to be solved, but studied. And like so many relics from the past, it tells us more through its mystery than through its clarity. In this final section, we examine what that mystery actually means. Let's begin with the numbers. When added together, the amounts in the scroll total more than 4,600 talents of precious metal, mostly silver. That's roughly 160,000 kilograms, or over 350,000 pounds. In today's terms, that would translate to several $billion worth of silver alone. But even that estimate is soft. The weights in the scroll are ancient units, and debate remains around their precise modern equivalents. Still, the implication is enormous. And here's the question that echoes through scholarly corridors like a whispered riddle. If this much treasure was hidden, where is it now? Some historians have traced clues backward, not through the geography of hills and springs, but through textual lineage. They ask, could the treasure be linked to the Second Temple in Jerusalem before it was destroyed by the Romans? The temple was not just a place of worship. It was a bank, a treasury, and a repository of wealth donated over generations. Pilgrims brought offerings. Kings left gifts. Priests managed sacred vessels, tax payments, incense stocks, and ritual gear. When the Romans sacked the city in 70 CE, they famously looted its riches. The Arch of Titus in Rome, still standing, depicts Roman soldiers carrying the golden menorah from the temple, along with other spoils. But some speculate that not all of the temple's wealth made it into Roman hands. According to this theory, a group of priests foresaw the invasion and acted swiftly, burying the temple's most sacred and valuable items in the Judean hills, hoping to one day retrieve them. Perhaps they etched the copper scroll as a guide for those who would survive. It's a compelling story, but it's also speculative. There's another possibility, one quieter, slower, and far more boring. It suggests that the copper scroll doesn't represent a single act of panic, but a gradual process of hoarding wealth by various priestly or sectarian communities in the region. In this view, the scroll is not a map to one treasure, but an accounting of many small caches, accumulated and hidden over decades. This would explain the repetition in the scroll, why so many entries resemble one another. It would also explain why many locations refer to obscure reservoirs or water sources, not famous cities. These were not central deposits. They were scattered safeguards, a decentralized system of trust. But even if that were true, why copper? Why choose such a difficult medium for a simple record? The answer may lie in intent. Unlike parchment or papyrus, which decays, copper endures. It cannot be easily altered. It preserves. So perhaps the scroll wasn't just a list. Perhaps it was a contract, a way of holding future generations accountable, a message across time from those who could not retrieve what they buried. Imagine that. Men in robes, chisel in hand, carving their inventory into metal, not for themselves, but for a community they could only hope would endure. Not warriors, not kings, just custodians. This theory aligns with what some scholars believe was the ethos of the Essenes, a sect thought to have lived at Qumran, the site where the Copper Scroll and many other Dead Sea Scrolls were found. The Essenes were deeply Sitmi, concerned with ritual purity, communal ownership, and the coming of a messianic age. They lived apart from society, kept strict codes, and viewed themselves as caretakers of divine law. If the Essenes, or a related group, created the Copper Scroll, they may have believed the treasure was not to be reclaimed until the arrival of the Messiah, at which point the righteous would recover the wealth to restore a new temple or establish a purified order. Not a treasure map, then, prophetic receipt. And still, the scroll remains unfulfilled. Some have tried. Over the decades, small groups of amateur diggers and adventurers have followed the instructions in the scroll. They've combed the cliffs near Qumran, dug near En-Gedi, traced topographical maps to ancient reservoirs. They found rocks, dust, bone, but no treasure. A few private expeditions remain shrouded in secrecy. Rumors swirl, a vessel here, a sealed jar there, but none confirmed. Geological authorities, especially in Jordan, have kept a tight grip on excavation in areas near Qumran. The region is also politically sensitive, with layers of jurisdiction and tension that complicate any serious excavation. Meanwhile, the scroll waits behind glass. Its copper has dulled to a dark patina. Its edges are jagged where it was cut open, but the letters are still there, small, sharp, uncompromising. And so, we return to the deeper question. Was the treasure ever meant to be found? This is where historians grow quiet, because it's possible that the treasure was never real, that it was a spiritual metaphor, a vision of what would be restored, or even a fiction designed to preserve hope. After all, Jewish tradition is rich with stories of lost gold, buried temples, sacred vessels, hidden from enemies. But if the scroll was a fabrication, why use copper? Why go to such trouble? No one knows. It may be that the Copper Scroll is the world's most elaborate dead end, a document of meticulous precision, pointing nowhere, or perhaps somewhere deep in the stone hills of the Dead Sea, behind a dry spring, beneath a collapsed channel, in a cave too shallow to catch the eye. There still lies a chest, not glowing, not grand, just there, waiting. That's what makes the Copper Scroll so powerful. It doesn't promise. It doesn't reward. It doesn't even name its authors. It simply records, and in that, captures something rare. The strange endurance of unclaimed knowledge, written in metal, lost in dust, and remembered not because it dazzled, but because it persisted. The scroll is not a story of treasure. It is a story of the human impulse to preserve, to leave behind something that might one day matter again, even if it never does. And now, after all this time, one question still hangs in the silence of the museum room. What else is buried? Not just in caves, but in records. We've forgotten how to read. You've seen paper. You've seen ink. You may have seen parchment, and even the aged leather of ancient codices, brittle from time and light. But few ever see copper used for writing. It's not the material one associates with delicate text or sacred scripture. And yet, the Copper Scroll, discovered in 1952 near the ancient ruins of Qumran, was not written on parchment or clay like the others. It was beaten, hammered, and chiseled into copper, and that choice alone, before even reading a word, whispers something different. It says, this was meant to last. So why would anyone go through the painstaking labor of inscribing Hebrew letters onto a sheet of copper when parchment was cheaper, more common, and easier to handle? To understand the answer, we must first understand the fears, pressures, and priorities of those who created it. Let's start with the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. Most were written on parchment made from animal skins, rolled into scrolls, and stored in clay jars. These texts, biblical, apocryphal, legal, sectarian, had deep spiritual and community value, but they were vulnerable. Parchment decays. It molds. It burns. It is, in every sense, mortal. And those who lived in Qumran, whether Essenes or another isolated sect, were no strangers to destruction. By the time this scroll was crafted, Jerusalem had already been sacked. The temple had already fallen to the Romans. And in the hills, people whispered of massacres, sieges, and the erasure of names and lineages. This was not an age of security. It was an age of erasure, and in an age of fire. You don't write your truths in paper. You etch them into metal. The scroll itself was made from a thin alloy sheet, 99% copper with trace amounts of tin, hammered flat and rolled tightly. The result was a brittle cylinder, which had to be carefully cut open centuries later by conservators in Manchester using saws and precision blades. Its surface was never meant to be pretty. There is no ornament, no illumination, no margins or embellishments. The letters are uneven, sometimes jagged, as if chiseled in haste or by untrained hands. But that makes sense. Copper is not smooth like vellum. It fights back. Scribe. You need force, not finesse. And that force meant commitment. Each letter took time. Each entry was deliberate. This was not casual writing, okay? It was record keeping with resistance. The writer knew that once the chisel met the copper, the word could not be changed. This scroll was not just meant to survive time. It was meant to outlast the fall of civilizations. You might ask, was this the only time copper was used for scripture? No, but it was rare. Ancient Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Persians occasionally used metal, particularly bronze or gold, for short inscriptions or royal proclamations. Bronze plates have been found listing treaties, lead tablets, or sometimes used for curses. Occasionally, copper or silver might be used for temple donations or votive texts, but to compose an entire scroll, dozens of lines, tense with location and measurement in copper, that was something else entirely. That was deliberate defiance against impermanence. Now, consider the scroll's content. Unlike the other Dead Sea Scrolls, this one does not offer prayers, hymns, or visions. It is a list of places, weights, of vessels, of coins and talents and hidden caches. It is bureaucratic, functional. Some have called it a treasure map, others a temple inventory. But regardless of interpretation, the contents are concrete, not spiritual. And that makes the use of copper even more logical. If you are preserving spiritual wisdom, you might rely on memory, prayer, and the chain of oral tradition. But if you are preserving a logistics documenta, reference guide for the recovery of wealth, you need something that will not fade. You need durability. And copper does not rot. It does not crumble. And, most importantly, it does not burn. This is where fire becomes important. The people of Qumran lived in a region that was no stranger to flames, natural or man-made. Drought could lead to wildfires. Conflict could lead to scorched homes and temples. The first temple had been burned. The second temple looted and desecrated. The scribes had every reason to believe that the world might burn again, and so they built a scroll that wouldn't. Perhaps they believed that if they could not preserve the temple, they could at least preserve the map to its memory. Or perhaps they feared the end so viscerally that they etched their hopes into a substance that outlasted all else. There's another theory worth mentioning. Some scholars believe the copper scroll was meant to be secreted only by a future generation or a messianic figure, by hiding the list in an obscure, unreadable medium. The scroll's authors ensured that no one without the right tools, skills, or timing could easily access it. Think about it. Anyone could unroll a parchment and read it aloud. but a copper scroll. To read it, you must first unroll the metal, a dangerous task that risks shattering the entire piece. Then you must decipher the hand-chiseled Hebrew etched without vowels, filled with abbreviations and archaic references. Then, if you succeed in translation, you face the next layer, interpretation. What is meant by the cistern beneath the portico in the Valley of Acre? What spring is referenced by the one that lies between the two olive trees near the third pillar? You see, the copper scroll does not yield its truths easily. And perhaps that was the point. It was not only a document of record, it was a test of patience, of endurance, of fidelity. Whoever was meant to find its treasure would need more than knowledge. They would need discipline. There's something haunting in that idea. Imagine being the last scribe in Qumran, brethren scattered, the temple in ruins. Sit by torchlight, hunched over a battered copper sheet, hammering the final lines of a list that may never be read. Your chisel strikes the metal like a heartbeat, slow, rhythmic. Finite dot. You know the Romans may find the caves. You know they may burn the scrolls. But this one, they will not burn. And in that thought, perhaps, is your final act of resistance. A record that endures not for glory, but because someone, someday, might still read it. And so, the copper scroll sits apart from its companions, not in theology, but in material. It is a testament not to divine revelation, but to human foresight, a document that refused to vanish, a list that no fire could erase. Why was it made of copper? Because those who made it believed that one day someone like you might ask that question. And now that you've asked, the scroll endures. When you think of a library, you likely picture shelves, paper, bindings, ink, neatly stacked columns of ideas. Okay, but what if your library had no shelves, no walls, no protection from water, fire, or war? What if it was a desert cave, and your texts were vulnerable not only to the sword, but to time itself? This was the challenge facing the community at Qumran when the copper scroll was composed likely between 50 and 70. Say, the people preserving its secrets had already begun to disappear. The Roman Empire, relentless in its expansion in response to rebellion, sweeping through Judea. The Great Jewish Revolt had erupted in 66 CE, and by 70 CE, Jerusalem would be in ruins. Preservation in such times was not scholarly. It was survival. Copper in this world was an act of resistance, not a silent act, but a screaming one. A public declaration made in private to work with copper. You had to commit to its difficulty. The sheet itself, about 0.6 millimeters thick, had to be flattened and prepared. Unlike parchment, it couldn't simply be scraped or trimmed. It had to be smelted, cooled, and beaten. That meant heat, metalworking tools, craftsmanship. And then came the writing, not ink and quill, but hammer and chisel, letter by letter. The copper didn't glide beneath the stylus. It fought back, demanded repetition, force, and a steady hand. You couldn't afford mistakes, no crossouts, no rewriting. Each entry was final. It's worth noting that the scroll was found in two parts, broken along its centerfold, eroded, curled, and oxidized. Yet the words still endured. The letters, though weathered, remained legible. The metal had turned green and brittle, but the message survived. It's this endurance that has led scholars to speculate that the choice of copper wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. Let's look more closely at what this scroll actually preserves in the 60-plus lines of text. There are roughly 64 entries each describing a buried treasure. Most entries list specific quantities, talents of gold, silver, ingots, ceremonial vessels. In all, Scholars estimate the scroll references more than 4,600 talents of precious metals, which, by modern standards, would be worth billions of dollars. Some have taken this at face value, treating the scroll as a literal inventory. Others believe it is symbolic, a kind of moral or eschatological teaching. And some say it's a hoax and elaborate deception. It's crafted to confuse enemies or preserve false hopes. But what no one disputes is this: the text was not meant to be lost. It wasn't thrown together. It was written with permanence in mind, and permanence in a desert under siege. Metal that the scroll's creators weren't alone in their concerns about preservation. Across the ancient world, civilizations struggled with how to outlive their empires. The Babylonians etched their laws into basalt. The Egyptians carved prayers into granite tombs. The Hittites used clay tablets, fired and sealed. But copper, like stone or clay, was both enduring and portable. It could be rolled, hidden, buried, and it could resist one of the greatest enemies of human knowledge: fire. Consider what fire has destroyed the Library of Alexandria, likely consumed in parts by flame. Remains history's most haunting symbol of intellectual loss. Thousands of scrolls, mathematics, astronomy, geography turned to ash. The sack of Jerusalem in 70 CE saw the Second Temple consumed by flames, its records and repositories lost. In such a world, the idea of a scroll that could not burn was radical, not because it was extravagant, but because it refused to vanish. There's a haunting beauty in that idea. We live in an era of digital permanence, cloud backups, blockchain, servers humming in cool underground rooms. But even now, we fear corruption, EMPs, cyber attacks, the slow erosion of data through incompatible file types. The copper scroll reminds us that even in antiquity, data preservation was a concern. Its authors were not merely religious. They were engineers of memory, archivists of a moment, and their material reflected their mindset: resilience, not readability. And yet, copper was never ideal for long-term legibility. Yes, it resists fire, but over time, copper corrodes. Oxidation forms verdigris green-blue crusts that can obscure or destroy the surface. The scroll, discovered, was so corroded it could not be unrolled. Scholars feared it would shatter if forced. It had to be sliced into strips using tiny saws in Manchester in the 1950s, each cut planned, each segment preserved. Then the strips were photographed, transcribed, and translated. Even in its survival, the scroll resisted being read. Perhaps this was poetic justice. The words were meant not for the Romans, not for the invaders. They were meant for those who came later. People who could wait. People with time. People like you. Let's linger on the question of why copper at that moment in history. By the 1st century CE, Jewish society was under extreme pressure. The Roman occupation had intensified. Taxes were heavy. Religious divisions grew sharper: Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, Essenes. Each faction had its texts, its priorities, its sense of urgency. For some, survival meant assimilation. For others, preservation meant hiding. And what do you do when you can no longer protect your community physically? You protect its record. Copper allowed for that, in ways clay never could. If a Roman soldier found a jar of parchment, he might burn it. If he found a copper scroll, he'd need tools. And even if he melted it down, he would still need to smelt etched that requires time, knowledge, and fuel. He might take the metal, but he might also discard it. A fire, after all, doesn't care what it consumes. But copper refuses. There's another layer to this, the metaphysical one. In the Hebrew Bible, metals carry spiritual weight. Gold is purity, silver, redemption, iron, strength. But copper negotiates more complicated. It's mentioned in the construction of the tabernacle. It lines the altar. It is used in utensils, instruments, sacred vessels. It is sacred, but serviceable. It reflects both devotion and durability. If the copper scroll is in some way a temple majorlist of hidden sacred objects, then the material used to record it was not neutral, it was intentional. The metal held spiritual meaning. It bore the weight of ritual. Writing upon it transformed the act from record-keeping to something more enduring, a covenant between time and memory. And so we return to the question, why was the scroll made of copper? Because it could not burn, because it could be hidden, because it was sacred enough to endure, but also, perhaps, because the scroll's authors believed something that we, too, sense when we touch the past, that some truths should outlast their owners, that some knowledge is worth preserving, even when its purpose fades, and that if you wait long enough and read slowly enough, even a battered piece of metal in a cave can whisper back the shape of a vanished world. By now, you've wandered beside the scroll, not reading it so much as listening to it breathe through centuries of corrosion and silence. Its copper body wasn't made for ease or elegance. It was made to endure, to carry a message through collapse, looting, empire, erosion, and excavation. But the real mystery is not why it was made of copper. The deeper mystery is this: what kind of knowledge would someone go to such lengths to preserve? And just as importantly, what kind of knowledge would someone fear enough to try to destroy? Because if copper was chosen to survive fire, then someone expected fire. If it was hammered to withstand time, then someone expected the world to fall apart. If its language was blunt, spare, and economic, then perhaps its message wasn't for beauty or reverence, but for retrieval. It wasn't meant to teach. It was meant to guide, like a map. And so, let's examine the scroll as a map. Not metaphorically, but literally. The copper scroll, unlike most Dead Sea Scrolls, doesn't contain prophecy, poetry, or law. It lists locations. Entries begin with phrases like, in the ruin that is in the valley of Akor, in the water conduit of the pool of ease, Sekak, under the stairs in the salt pit, Over and over, it names geographic landmarks, structural clues, measurements. But there's a strange contradiction. Many of these places are vague. Some exist only in older texts. Others never appear anywhere else. Some may have changed names, or disappeared under the weight of earthquakes, erosion, or human development. The scroll is simultaneously precise and imprecise. It offers coordinates without a map, units of weight without a clear baseline, and artifacts without context. It's not a clear set of directions. It's a puzzle in metal, and that may be the point. There are scholars who believe the copper scroll was never meant to be used in its own time, that it was designed as a time capsule, not for the next generation, but for a distant, safer future. Think of it as a conversation, not with the present, but with posterity. In that sense, copper becomes not just a durable material, but a time lock, a protective vault, inscribed with instructions only someone far removed and far safer might try to decode. Some even believe the treasures listed may not have been actual caches of silver or gold, but metaphorical references to texts, priestly records, sacred rituals. Yet, if that were the case, why make it so physical? Why describe stairs, pits, wells, and thresholds? Why carve it in copper, an expensive, rare, and cumbersome material, unless it wasn't metaphor at all? It's here the narrative begins to shift from archaeological curiosity to something closer to an obsession. Across the 20th and 21st centuries, dozens of scholars, explorers, and amateur treasure hunters have tried to follow the scroll. Some have gone into the caves near Qumran. Others have mapped the entries to Jerusalem, and areas around the Dead Sea. Some believe the treasures were temple reserves, hidden during the Roman siege of 70 CE. Others suggest the Essenes, a monastic Jewish sect thought to have lived near Qumran, created the scroll as a record of their own sacred holdings, buried before fleeing destruction. But all who've searched have run into the same problem. Nothing has been found. No gold, no jars of silver, no temple items, no confirming artifacts. And so, a new theory emerged. Perhaps the treasure was retrieved long ago in secrecy, or perhaps it never existed. This is where the story grows quiet, not because it ends, but because it reaches its true depth. The quiet grief of lost knowledge. The copper scroll. Was it made of copper just because it was durable? It was made of copper because its authors didn't trust history to survive without force. Paper burns, clay cracks, parchment dissolves, ink fades, but copper resists forgetting. It can rust, corrode, discolor. But even then, its scars can be read. Letters can be lifted from its decay. Meaning can be coaxed from its oxidation. In a way, copper remembers even after it has been broken. That makes it an act of defiance. But let's step back now, not into theory, but into process. Imagine the scroll's creation. A team of scribes, likely trained not in ink, but metallurgy, sits before sheets of hammered copper. Perhaps they're underground. Perhaps not. Perhaps a single lamp burns above them. Beside them, lists. Perhaps not even their own lists, but dictated texts from temple priests or guardians of communal wealth. A scribe hammers each Hebrew letter into copper. No grammar embellishment. No theological reflection. It's just items, weights, locations. Each stroke must be deliberate. The metal gives no second chances. It is noisy work. It's not poetic. It's not lyrical, but necessary. Each thud of the chisel is a commitment to memory, a prayer for future rediscovery, a message for those who survived the fire. We imagine scribes as writers, but here they are archivists of catastrophe. Some suggest the scroll was not written in one sitting, or even 1 year, that it may have been compiled over time as a ledger grows, entry by entry, each line added not in hope, but in preparation, a readiness not for war, but for loss. And so the copper scroll becomes a record of what mattered most when everything else was slipping away. Not theology, not law, but location, where it is, how deep it is, what it's next to, how much it weighs it is. In a way, the most human of documents, not idealistic, just practical, because when the flames come, you don't save ideas, you save where to find them again. And so now, centuries later, archaeologists walk those same lands. They carry translation printouts, artisanal maps, satellite imagery. They trace the landscape, wondering if that dry wadi matches a named location. That buried stone might be the ruin of an altar, but nothing definitive has ever surfaced. Some say the items were looted centuries ago. Some believe the Romans, despite their violence, never found them. Some even whisper that the treasure was never hidden at all, but lost before the scroll was finished. An incomplete memory, a catalog of ghosts. Still, the copper remains. In 2004, new imaging technologies were used on the scroll, including laser scanning and 3D modeling to enhance faded inscriptions. More words emerged, slight variants, corrections. The metal continued to speak, even in pain, even in silence. Today, the copper scroll is stored safely in Amman, Jordan, preserved and studied. Its text has been digitized, its dimensions recorded. It has been rendered into English, German, Hebrew, but the mystery persists, because even when every word is legible, the meaning remains buried. And perhaps that was always the point. Perhaps some things were meant not to be found, only sought, because it is the seeking that preserves memory and the failure to find that keeps the past awake. You're standing now in a room full of scholars, none of whom can agree on what they're looking at. In front of you, behind glass, is a damaged object, not a beautiful one. It's not ornate or ceremonial. It's metal, curved and greenish, pitted by time. Its edges are torn. Its script is faint. It is neither mysterious in form nor pleasant to behold. And yet, it may be the most obsessively examined scroll in all of archaeology. This is the Copper Scroll, and unlike its cousins found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, it is not written on parchment or papyrus. It doesn't speak of law, prophecy, or moral order. It does not instruct. It does not pray. Simply lists again and again and again, 64 times. In fact, it names locations. It notes weights of silver, gold, and precious items. It gives distances, directions, structural clues. But what it doesn't give is a map, not a single illustration, not a single guiding symbol, just lines of hammered Hebrew etched into a metal that does not burn. And somehow, those lines, those dry, repetitive lines have become one of the great historical riddles of the ancient world, because not one of the 64 treasures listed in the scroll has ever been found. Not one. Let's begin with what the scroll actually says. Entry after entry starts with a phrase like, "In the cave that is next to the spring of Shava, under the third row of stones, at the tomb in the valley of Acre, in the cistern of the courtyard of the tomb, beneath the great mound on the east." You get the idea. Each location is followed by measurements, typically in talents, a unit of weight, roughly 30 to 35 kilograms. And then a material, gold or silver, mostly, sometimes mixed with vessels, sacramental items, or scrolls. Some entries are simple. Others contain multiple clauses, turns, corrections, or confusing references. One entry alone describes 70 talents of silver hidden beneath. It's a large stone under the water conduit at the entrance to the tomb in the eastern courtyard. 70 talents is roughly 2,100 kilograms for 4,600 pounds of silver. That's just one line. Multiply that by 64. A total treasure described is almost unthinkable. Estimates vary wildly, but some suggest the full value in today's market could stretch into the billions. But no trace has ever been found. No hoards, no markers, no altarpieces, no scraps of broken jars. So, what are we looking at? There are a few possibilities, none of them entirely satisfying. Theory 1. The scroll is authentic, but the treasure was retrieved. Some scholars believe the treasure was real and may have been recovered by those who buried it or their descendants after the danger passed. This would explain why nothing remains to be found. The Copper Scroll may have been hidden and then rediscovered by the same community. Once the valuables were reclaimed, the scroll became obsolete, discarded, or forgotten. But this idea raises questions. If the treasures were reclaimed, why no historical mention of such an enormous recovery? And why risk making the list so elaborate if the creators expect it to return soon? Theory 2. The scroll is a fake or a riddle. Another camp argues that the scroll may have been symbolic or even deceptive. Perhaps it was designed to mislead, to protect a real cache elsewhere. Or maybe it was a sacred riddle known only to the Essene initiates. Yet, if it were a decoy or symbolic text, why use copper? Why risk creating such a permanent, labor-intensive object for a deception? Theory 3. The locations are real, but misunderstood. This third theory is the most popular among modern archaeologists. They believe the scroll is real. So are the locations. But that we are completely misreading the references. Place names have changed. Landmarks are gone. Measurements are based on ancient systems we only partially understand. Even linguistic differences play a role. The scroll uses a Hebrew that's closer to Mishnaic or late biblical forms, subtle but important for interpretation. A sister might not mean what we think it means. Valley of Acre may have referred to different places in different eras. In short, the map still exists. We just no longer know how to read it. The problem deepens when you realize how scroll diverges from the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The other scrolls found at Qumran, around 900 of them, are theological, legal, poetic, or ritual in nature. They speak of community rules, messianic expectations, and interpretations of Scripture, but the Copper Scroll contains none of that. It is utilitarian, material, grounded in objects and spaces. This has led some to believe that it may not have originated from the Qumran sect at all, but from an entirely different group who used the Qumran caves as emergency storage. Some even propose that it was hidden by a temple. Priests fleeing Jerusalem during the Roman siege of 70 CE that would make the treasure's temple reserves sacred silver, ritual gold, financial assets meant to fund a restoration of worship once the empire collapsed. The logic checks out. Jerusalem, under siege, was collapsing. Its defenders may have hidden reserves in surrounding areas. A durable, coded inventory would be necessary, and Qumran, already a remote site with existing caves, would be ideal. But this brings us back to the same riddle. Where did they hide it? And why can't we find even one of the 64 deposits? The scroll also offers no organizing principle. The entries do not follow a clear geographic pattern. They are not arranged by size, distance, or material. Some mention caves, others tombs. Some involve architectural markers. Others describe open terrain. It's not a neat circuit, not a walking tour, not even a regional survey. Instead, it reads like a memory palace gone cold. Pieces of a world whose structure we've lost. One location mentions the cistern beside the eastern pillar. But of what? Another lists the third stone step at the ruins of Mattia. Where is Mattia? In one case, the entry describes treasure buried under the ashes, suggesting the site had already been destroyed when the scroll was written. We are left with fragments of intention, disconnected from their terrain. A map without a compass, path drawn in vanished dirt. Still, people have tried. Some have spent decades attempting to correlate the entries with biblical geography. Others have conducted DIGs, legally and illegally, across the Judean wilderness. One man spent over 30 years searching caves and ruins near Moya, Jericho. Another built a digital model of the Copper Scroll's instructions and overlaid them, on satellite data. Some even involved ground-penetrating radar. But still, nothing, not even a coin. This has led some to suspect that treasures were discovered and looted long ago, maybe even by the Romans themselves. Others argue the scroll was a decoy, made to confuse would-be raiders, or even an act of religious defiance, to record the holy treasures in a way that would deny Rome any hope of claiming them. Yet another theory holds a quiet dignity. What if the Copper Scroll was created not out of panic or trickery, but out of grief? Imagine a priestly scribe, knowing Jerusalem would fall, knowing the sanctuary would burn, knowing the temple's riches would be scattered, stolen, desecrated. What could he do? He couldn't stop the fire. He couldn't protect the altar. But maybe he could remember. And so he took copper, he hammered it flat, and he began to list each location, each weight, each vessel, not because he expected them to be found, but because he refused to let them be forgotten. Not a map, not a riddle, a eulogy, a record of what once was holy. In that case, treasures aren't lost because we haven't looked hard enough. They're lost because that was their fate, because the world changed, because roads vanished, because names were forgotten, because ruins crumbled and valleys shifted. But the scroll remains, a fossil of precision in an age of chaos, a last breath of order, even now. In its cracked, corroded form, it tells us something about the past, that even when kingdoms fall and gold turns to dust, someone, somewhere, wanted to remember, even without a map, even without hope, just memory, hammered into metal, into metal. If you listen closely to the community that studies the Copper Scroll, you'll hear more sighs than shouts. Not because they've lost faith, but because they've lost patience with certainty. That is, this isn't a story of discovery. It's the story of a scroll that refuses to be solved, and those who've tried. They leave behind a strange trail of chalk-dusted boots, conflicting theories, quiet obsessions, and shelves full of books, all circling the same problem. The scroll describes 64 deposits of treasure, with no clear map, no names we can be sure of, and no trace of any of it found. But people have tried, and tried, and tried again. Let's follow them for a while. One of the earliest Copper Scroll hunters was a man named John Allegro, a British scholar who helped translate the scroll in the 1950s. He was a member of the original Dead Sea Scrolls team, but Allegro quickly diverged from the consensus. While others focused on theological documents, Allegro grew fascinated, or perhaps fixated, on the scroll made of copper. He believed, quite literally, that the treasures it listed were real and hidden somewhere near Qumran. He was so convinced, in fact, that he persuaded the Jordanian government to allow him to search. Armed with his notes, a few assistants, and an archaeologist's trowel, he scoured the cliffs and caves near the Dead Sea. In 1959, he even conducted a modest excavation near what he believed to be one of the scroll's described locations, but he found nothing. Still, Allegro published a book in 1960, confidently titled The Treasure of the Copper Scroll. In it, he laid out a speculative theory that the hoard belonged to the Essenes, the sect that likely lived at Qumran, and that they had hidden their communal wealth before the Roman advance. But most scholars disagreed, and loudly they accused Allegro of being too literal, too quick to public. One reviewer wrote, "Allegro seems determined to find treasure, whether historical, spiritual, or financial, and has not considered that this scroll might speak in riddles." Another said, "It is a list, but not a list to be followed. It is a warning, not an invitation." Allegro's reputation never fully recovered. In time, he drifted toward fringe theories, including one linking early Christianity to hallucinogenic mushrooms. But that's another story. Other hunters followed in the 1960s and 70s. Theodore Gaster, Frank Cross, and others attempted new translations. Each tried to improve the phrasing to unlock hidden meanings in the syntax. After all, the Hebrew of the Copper Scroll isn't exactly classical. It's terse, elliptical, and sometimes ambiguous. The problem wasn't just the terrain, it was the language itself. Take, for instance, this entry in the funeral shrine. In the third row of stones, 100 gold ingots. Now, what does funeral shrine mean? Is it a known tune complex? Is it ceremonial or local? What about third row? Stacked from the front or the side? Are the stones stacked vertically or arranged in a circle? Okay, and gold ingots. What shape? What weight? Every phrase raises questions, and each question has 5 or 6 possible answers. In the 1980s, new name entered the conversation: Vendel Jones, a Texan who believed he was following literal clues, not just to wealth, but to biblical prophecy. Jones saw the Copper Scroll as a roadmap to the lost treasures of the First Temple, including the Ark of the Covenant. He gained attention, gained and some financial backing, and conducted digs in the Qumran area for years. He found some pottery fragments, a few artifacts, and a substance he believed might be balsamic oil used by temple priests. But he never found gold. Still, Jones insisted his work was guided by scripture, archaeology, and divine inspiration. To this day, some of his supporters claim that parts of his research align with newly digitized scroll interpretations. Mainstream scholars, again, remained unconvinced. By the 1990s, treasure hunting had taken on a digital edge. Amateur researchers began publishing hypotheses online. Maps were uploaded. Hebrew phrases were debated in forums. Some tried to correlate the scroll's references with modern topography using satellite imagery. They looked for anomalies in the terrain, signs of hidden caves, buried walls, unnatural soil patterns. One group even used ground-penetrating radar near Qumran and did identify a few underground voids. But these turned out to be natural fissures or previously looted tombs. Not one of the 64 locations on the scroll has produced so much as a silver ring. And so, the list remains vivid in promise, silent in proof. There are other possibilities. Some scholars believe that the entire scroll was composed as a kind of ritual act, a way of preserving the memory of temple wealth through language, not location. Perhaps the treasure was never meant to be recovered, only recorded. This theory holds that, after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, surviving priests or scribes may have created the copper scroll not to direct anyone to treasure, but to bear witness to what was lost. In other words, it's a sacred inventory, and that's where the nature of copper becomes important. Why not write it on parchment? Why not etch it into clay? Because copper endures. Copper is hard to destroy. It resists fire. It is neither brittle like pottery, nor perishable like leather or papyrus. To write on copper is to say, let this last. The scroll is a eulogy, not a map. Then the treasures aren't missing. They're memorialized. Enough, and yet, you can't help but keep looking. It's a deeply human instinct to believe that knowledge leads to something tangible. To believe that if a scroll lists 64 places where treasure is buried, we should be able to go out and dig, and if we can't, then we assume something must be missing from our understanding. Maybe we misread talent. Maybe cistern really means vault. Maybe east of the pillar once referred to an orientation we no longer recognize. That's the terrible beauty of archaeology. You are always reading the last page of a book with the middle chapters missing. You are always trying to untranslate. It's time. There's a final theory worth considering. Some have suggested that the copper scroll may have been compiled over years, or even decades, as a running record of items hidden by various groups. In this model, the entries don't form a single map, but a patchwork of multiple hiding efforts across time. Different authors, different scribes, different locations. That would explain the lack of internal consistency. It would also explain why no obvious pattern emerges. It isn't one plan. It's the last pages of a much longer lost ledger. A whisper of treasures scattered by fear, buried in haste, recorded with trembling hands. Today, the scroll sits in a museum, safe behind glass, but it's also scattered mentally, digitally, emotionally, across the minds of hundreds of researchers, hobbyists, and dreamers. Each one holds a piece of the mystery. Each one hopes that maybe, just maybe, the next clue will make everything click. That some forgotten landmark, some linguistic breakthrough, some ground scan will reveal a hoard, a chamber, a glint of silver beneath the soil. But until then, copper scroll remains a strange kind of mirror. We look into it, expecting gold. What we find instead is our own longing for meaning in maps we cannot read, and the unrelenting silence of a list that refuses to come true. It's strange how something can be so thoroughly preserved, and yet so thoroughly untraceable. The copper scroll has outlasted the parchment books of its time. It's more durable than the papyrus fragments found beside it. It resisted decay, war, and weather. It was hidden in a cave for nearly 2,000 years, surviving undisturbed until the 1950s. And yet, what it describes has vanished entirely. Not a single one of the 64 listed deposits, said to contain tons of gold, silver, and temple vessels, has been found. Not even one has been confidently located. Scroll remains, but its substance is gone. So, what happened? Where did it all go? And why, in a world brimming with experts, tools, and theories, does this list, so specific, so numerical, lead nowhere? To understand that, we need to look not at what the scroll says, but at what time in history have quietly undone. Let's begin with the simplest possibility. The treasures were found and removed long ago. Some scholars argue that the Romans, or perhaps local villagers after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, discovered some of these hidden hoards and looted them. If the scroll represents deposits made in desperation during the Jewish-Roman wars, then the logical assumption is that those who buried the treasure were either killed, enslaved, or exiled and never returned to retrieve it. This vacuum would have created opportunity. Consider, after the first Jewish revolt, Roman soldiers and local scavengers swept through Judea. The temple was in ruins. Entire towns were razed. Found in this chaotic aftermath, hundreds of caves and cisterns would have been exposed. Many of the sites mentioned in the scroll, next to the pillar, beneath the steps, inside the aqueduct, may well have been uncovered and emptied centuries ago. If that's true, then the copper scroll is not a map to lost treasure. It's a tombstone for treasure already taken. There's another possibility. The treasures were never buried at all. The scroll could be a projection, a list of intended deposits that were never actually completed. It may have been compiled by temple officials, seeing scribes, or other groups who wanted to protect their sacred vessels and funds. Perhaps they prepared the scroll in anticipation of hiding the items, but events moved faster than expected. The war escalated. The walls fell. Plans failed. If that were the case, then the scroll becomes a record of what was meant to happen. It's not what did. A dream interrupted by reality. Of course, there's a more unsettling theory, the one most often whispered but rarely admitted aloud. What if the scroll is a deliberate riddle, a fake? Not in the sense of being modern. Few scholars believe it's a forgery. But what if it was meant to confuse, kind of cryptic puzzle composed during a time of stress when clarity could be dangerous? Think of it this way. If you needed to protect something truly valuable from invading armies, what better strategy than to describe its location in riddles only insiders could decode? The language of the copper scroll is unusual. It doesn't read like religious scripture, nor like a typical inventory. The Hebrew is direct, but oddly structured. Some believe it's a coded dialect, perhaps one only understandable to members of a specific priestly class or temple faction. In this reading, third cistern near the bathhouse might refer not to a physical location, but to a known reference point within a now lost system of metaphor. We are trying to solve a cipher whose key vanished 2,000 years ago. That kind of silence is not accidental. It is a design. It's also possible that the scroll describes treasures spread across a much wider region than we assume. Most treasure hunters concentrate near Qumran, assuming geographic proximity. But the scroll itself never states that all the hoards are nearby. Some of the descriptions mention distances, but they don't always line up. What if some of the treasures lie beneath modern-day Ammon, or Hebron, or deep in the Judean wilderness? What if one hoard is now beneath a shopping plaza, another beneath a dry wadi that has shifted over centuries? Geography changes. Cities rise and fall. Rivers move. Stones collapse. A scroll that once corresponded to real landmarks now reads like myth, because the land itself has forgotten. Then there is the issue of language. The Hebrew of the copper scroll is distinct, a short, almost administrative style of writing, not found in the other Dead Sea Scrolls. This difference has led some scholars to speculate that it was not composed by the Essenes at all, but by priests or scribes associated with the temple in Jerusalem. If so, scroll might not reflect Qumran-based activity at all. It could represent a final effort in the waning days of Jerusalem to document or misdirect the locations of sacred wealth in this interpretation. The scroll is a remnant of panic. Imagine the temple is burning. The priests are scattering. Romans are at the gates. One man is ordered to record where the wealth is going. The vessels, keys, the altar tools, the silver trumpets. He has no parchment case, no papyrus, only copper sheets meant for some other purpose. He writes quickly in lists. 6 entries, each one a prayer or a lie. He seals the scroll and hides it in a cave, and then dies before telling anyone where it was. The scroll sat hidden in Cave 3 for nearly 1,900 years. When it was found in 1952, no one knew what to make of it. It was too brittle to unroll. Eventually, it had to be cut into strips to be read. Its contents stunned scholars. This wasn't theology. It wasn't apocalyptic. It was precise, so precise it felt suspicious. 64 entries, hundreds of talents of gold and silver, cisterns, tombs, aqueducts. No commentary, no context, just a list. Some dismissed it immediately, too fantastic to be true. Others believed it hinted at something massive, either a real treasure or a real fear, or both. But here we are, 70 years later, still reading, still guessing. The paradox is this: the copper scroll is among the most tangible of the Dead Sea Scrolls, etched in metal, etched, legible, and yet it is also the most intangible in meaning. Its sister scrolls offer spiritual reflection, hymns, rules, visions. This one offers 64 promises it cannot keep, and so we are left circling it like a well, looking down into the dark, hearing our own theories echo back, even if none of the treasure is ever found. The scroll has given us something stranger than gold. It has shown how easily certainty can dissolve. You can hold the words in your hand. You can translate them, map them, debate them, and still never know what they mean. The copper scroll forces us to confront a humbling truth, that history, even when preserved, does not always yield, that some records are not records. Some inventories are not instructions. Some maps are not maps. They are reminders that the past has corners we cannot see, that human memory fades, that even etched metal cannot always resist forgetting. And perhaps that's the final gift of the copper scroll. Not the promise of treasure, but the quiet realization that some knowledge survives not to be solved, but simply to be wondered about endlessly. The story of the copper scroll is not just about what it says, it's about how it was heard, or more precisely, how it refused to speak. Unlike most of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the copper scroll did not greet its discoverers with crisp parchment, elegant lines of biblical commentary, or the soft dust of long-decayed linen wraps. It greeted them like a rusted relic of an empire gone silent. It was not elegant. It was stubborn. It was rolled so tightly, so oxidized, so wounded by time that it could not be opened at all. Imagine the scene in 1952. A group of scholars, exhausted, sunburned, and disoriented, staring at a corroded, tube-like artifact found tucked deep inside Cave 3 at Qumran. It did not look like scripture. It did not even look like a scroll. At first glance, it was mistaken for a container, a cylinder, a weapon. Perhaps it was not until they noticed faint traces of inscribed letters across its curved outer surface that the truth began to unfold. This was a document, a scroll not made of fragile parchment or reed-thin papyrus, but hammered metal, thin sheets of pure copper alloyed with just a hint of tin. It was as if the author had been trying to defy time itself and succeeded, but at a cost. A scroll meant to endure. Most ancient texts are lost to decay, fire, or accident. Those that survive do so through copying scribes, scrolls giving way to books, memory replacing fragility with repetition. but the copper scrolls skipped the entire game of duplication. It was written to last, not to be read. That distinction mattered. The copper was meant to preserve, not to share, but in doing so, sealed its words shut. After its discovery, teams from the Jordanian Department of Antiquities examined the scroll. They couldn't unroll it by hand. The copper had corroded, hardened into a brittle spiral that would shatter if touched too forcefully. For months, the artifact was studied like a puzzle no one could open, so they made a choice. If it couldn't be unrolled, it would have to be sawed open. A British scholar named H. Wright Baker was assigned this task. Using a tiny circular saw, he delicately cut the scroll into 23 curved sections. The process was painstaking, dangerous, and irreversible. If he slipped, a single letter could be destroyed. But there was no alternative, and when the pieces were finally laid flat like fragments of an ancient metallic snake, the scholars peered in and realized what they had uncovered. Not prayers, not poetry, not apocalypse, but a list in the ruin that is in the Valley of Acre. The text was unlike anything in the known corpus of ancient Hebrew scripture. The lines were blunt, formulaic. Each began with a location, usually cryptic, often vague. Then came a quantity of gold or silver. Then instructions: under, near, behind, within. In the cistern that is in the court of the peristyle, dig. Under the third step, 20 cubits deep, there lies. In the tomb of the third column, beneath the water channel, the words were clear, but their meaning was not. Where were these places? What did they refer to? Were they metaphor? Were they code? The scholars had never seen anything like it. A language without a context. The Hebrew of the copper scroll was strange, archaic, and clipped. Some of its grammar mirrored the biblical period, but its tone was bureaucratic, utilitarian. Key, it read, like a tax document from an empire no longer standing. It used certain vocabulary that puzzled linguists, terms for architecture, treasure, and weight that had rarely been recorded before. It seemed to blend legal phrasing with topographic specificity, like a surveyor's list written in a sacred tongue. This was not the soaring spiritual Hebrew of the Psalms. This was not the complex legalese of Leviticus. This was something else. One scholar, Father Joseph Milik, a Polish expert on Semitic languages, attempted a direct translation. He approached it like an engineer rather than a theologian. To him, it was a technical document. He concluded that it must have originated not from Qumran, but from the temple itself, or someone intimately familiar with its rituals and wealth. But there was a problem. The scroll referenced dozens of locations that no longer existed or were never clearly named. Scholars compared it to trying to follow directions in a city where all the street signs had been removed. In the valley of the column, at the juncture of the twin tombs, near the oak tree that leans toward the water. What oak tree? What tombs? Time had stolen the landmarks, but left the directions. Theories and divides as more researchers began analyzing the text. Theories multiplied. Some believed the scroll was tied to the Second Temple priests who had hidden their wealth in the face of Roman attack. Others thought it came from the Essenes, a monastic sect who might have buried temple goods they had secretly preserved or stolen decades earlier. Still others proposed that the scroll referenced mythical treasure, perhaps echoing older traditions, Solomon's wealth or temple, vessels hidden during the Babylonian exile. Each theory depended on assumptions about where the scroll had come from. The problem: its language didn't clearly tie it to any group. Its metal medium was unique. No other Dead Sea Scrolls were written in copper, and its purpose remained a riddle. Modern machines, ancient words by the 1990s, advanced imaging techniques allowed scholars to photograph the scroll fragments in high resolution. Under these digital magnifiers, tiny scratches, faint letters, and faded ink guides became visible. Yet even with better technology, the core mystery remained. What was the scroll for? Was it truly a map or a monument? Was it a warning, a record, a decoy? Computer-aided reconstructions revealed some parts had been erased and rewritten, suggesting that even the original author may have revised it. That raised more questions. Was the author working from memory? Was he changing locations as he wrote? Is this a working draft or a final record? And if it was a final version, why was there only one? A scroll meant for no one. Perhaps the most haunting theory of all is that the copper scroll was never meant to be read again, only discovered. Its copper body may have been chosen, not for clarity, but for symbolism. It would not decay, it would not burn, could not be eaten by worms or fade in light. It was a time capsule, not for public consumption, for divine witness. Whoever wrote it may have believed that even if all else was lost, this single list would survive to stand as a record, not of what had been found, but of what had once been worthy of hiding. It's a strange kind of literature, not meant to be understood, only to be remembered when meaning phrase for the scholars who spend decades decoding ancient texts. The copper scroll is both a treasure and a torment. It defies translation, not because its words are unclear, but because the references are gone. The nouns remain. The world they describe does not, as one scholar noted. It is like a phone book from a city that no longer exists, in a language no one speaks, where every street has been renamed. And yet, there is value in this difficulty, because the scroll reminds us of something uncomfortable but necessary. That preservation does not guarantee understanding, that survival is not the same as clarity, and that even when words endure, their world may have already vanished. What happens when we finish reading? The copper scroll has now been translated dozens of times, its Hebrew transcribed, its locations mapped, its measurements weighed and converted, and yet we still don't know who wrote it, why it was sealed in metal. What treasure, if any, still lies beneath the soil? Perhaps the answers are not in the ground, but in the silence it leaves behind. Because the copper scroll doesn't just preserve a list, it preserves a gesture, a final act of human memory, a list scratched into copper during a moment of collapse, a moment when someone, maybe a priest, maybe a rebel, believed that recording was more important than escaping. He could not save the temple, he could not save the people, but he could save this list, not for the Romans, not for the future, maybe not even for us, just for the record, just so the past wouldn't go down completely without a trace. When the copper scroll was finally laid bare, sawed into panels, cleaned, read under intense light, it began to offer its secrets. But those secrets came with riddles. The letters were mostly legible, but the meanings slipped like water through a net. Some phrases seemed straightforward, others were unlike anything found in known Hebrew texts. And while the scroll was written in a form of Hebrew, it felt like it had passed through a different mouth, one that mumbled instead of sang. You must remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls had already sent ripples through the scholarly world. Texts, hundreds of fragile parchments from Qumran, had revealed everything from previously unknown psalms to variant versions of the Hebrew Bible. Some spoke of apocalyptic wars, of priestly orders, of rules and punishments and messianic hopes. But the copper scroll, it spoke of treasure with the tone of a warehouse clerk. The scroll contains 64 entries. Each one lists a hoard, mostly gold and silver, along with where it was hidden, and often how deep to dig. In the reservoir that is in the valley, under the steps. The third cubit. The detail is maddening. It gives too much and too little at once. And what troubled scholars wasn't just the precision. It was the fact that none of the locations made perfect sense. The names didn't match biblical geography, and the Hebrew itself was odd. Why the Hebrew felt wrong languages don't. Sit still. Hebrew of the 1st century CE was already a patchwork. In Jerusalem, Aramaic was the dominant tongue. Hebrew was mostly liturgical. Greek had spread widely. Latin hovered at the edges. But the Hebrew in the copper scroll was different. It was written in Mishnaic Hebrew, but with orthographic quirks and unusual words. And, more than anything, it lacked the rhythm, beauty, and structure found in traditional religious scrolls. It was clipped, functional. Some lines omitted expected verbs. Some used rare vocabulary. It was as if someone had taken biblical Hebrew and stripped it of its poetry, leaving behind only nouns and numbers. One word that appears repeatedly is talentas, in talents of gold or silver. This is a weight, not a currency. A talent of silver weighs roughly 75 pounds. Multiply that by 65 deposits, and you begin to understand what's being described. Not symbolic wealth, but physical mass. In fact, the scroll estimates over 4,600 talents of precious metals. That's more than 100 tons of treasure. This alone troubled readers. No known community at Qumran could have possessed such wealth. Even the Second Temple treasury likely wouldn't have contained such quantities unless it had been stockpiling for decades, maybe centuries. So where had this list come from, and how had it ended up in a cave? The scroll that broke the pattern. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were religious in tone. Commentaries on prophets, rewritten Genesis stories, community rules. The Copper Scroll, in contrast, made no mention of God, prophets, angels, or messiahs. There are no moral instructions, no eschatology, no prayers. It is, in tone and format, entirely secular. This posed a problem. Scholars had assumed the scrolls were the product of a single community, likely the Essenes, an apocalyptic Jewish sect living near Qumran. But if that were true, why would this document read like a treasure map? Some scholars began to speculate. Was the scroll even written by the same people? Or was it deposited in the cave during a time of crisis, placed there hastily by someone passing through? Even the medium pointed to this possibility. Copper was expensive, hard to work with. No other scrolls were made of it. If one intended to preserve something for eternity through fire, flood, and empire, copper made a kind of sense. But it wasn't casual. Reconstructing a language without a people, the scholars who worked to decode the Copper Scroll were archaeologists, historians, linguists, and often detectives. They had no roadmap. They had a strange dialect, unclear references, and place names that no longer existed. To make sense of the text, they began building databases of biblical and extra-biblical place names, looking for overlaps. Some names appeared in the Mishnah, others in Josephus. Some seemed to match modern topography, barely. For instance, in the Valley of Acre, this appears in Joshua 7:24. But where exactly is the Valley of Acre today? Some identify it near Wadi Kelt, others further southeast near Jericho. Without firm archaeological anchors, each name became a ghost. So scholars looked beyond language. They looked to the intent of the document. Was this a real list or a symbolic one? There were two schools of thought. One, the literalists. These scholars believed the scroll recorded real treasure hidden during the Roman siege of Jerusalem around 70 CE. Perhaps it was deposited by temple priests fleeing the destruction. In this view, the Copper Scroll is a relic of desperation, a last-ditch record of riches buried in haste, meant to be retrieved when peace returned. But the problem? No one has ever found even one of the 64 treasures. 2. The skeptics. These scholars argue the scroll is symbolic. Maybe it's a ritual document, a kind of temple inventory in exile. Perhaps it was meant as a spiritual ledger, listing not real hoards, but metaphorical ones, a hidden kingdom of faith. Or perhaps it was a decoy, a diversion. If it was meant to trick looters or protect the real treasure, it may have done its job too well. But there's another possibility, that the scroll was never meant to be understood. The vocabulary of absence. There's something haunting about trying to decode a language where every word is a reference to something lost. That's what scholars faced. Some of the architectural terms, like peristyle, cornice, cistern chamber, seem Greek-influenced. Others are purely Semitic. Some refer to steps, tombs, aqueducts, trees, and stones. The instructions are always tactile. Go here, dig this far, find what lies beneath. But for each instruction, the physical world it described was long gone. Earthquakes, erosion, conquest, and time had erased nearly all of it. So, when scholars read, under the third step at the back of the reservoir, they were forced to imagine a place that may no longer exist. Even the weights and measures used in the scroll talents. Minas, cubits are part of a vanished system. Their values had to be reconstructed from biblical comparisons and Babylonian tablets. This is the vocabulary of a people trying to preserve something from falling into total amnesia. Scholars across centuries throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Different scholars brought their tools to bear. Frank Moorcross, a Harvard professor, called the scroll the most enigmatic and tantalizing of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. Emile Piech, a French linguist, worked to revise the translation in the 1990s using advanced photographic methods. The Copper Scroll Project, launched in the early 2000s by Jim Barfield, a former fire investigator, claimed to have deciphered several locations mentioned in the scroll, mostly near Qumran. His efforts gained media attention, but no treasure. There were even expeditions, some quasi-official, others amateur to dig where the scroll hinted. All ended in silence. Sand, stone, no gold, no silver. Yet the scrolls still speaks, because the value isn't just in what might be buried, but in the attempt to remember how to find something, even when the map has rotted and the roads have changed. Translation is resurrection in a way. Translating the Copper Scroll has become an act of resurrecting forgotten purpose. The scholars aren't just decoding a list, they're decoding a mindset. Someone 2,000 years ago had a system, a way of naming, storing, marking, and remembering. Today, as modern cities sprawl over biblical landscapes, that mindset is gone, but the scroll remains as a faint record of it, and with each line, a scholar translates. A small piece of that world flickers back to life. A cave mouth hidden behind fig trees. A step worn by feet that no longer walk. A talent of silver, wrapped in linen, waiting to be unearthed by someone who never came back. By the late 1990s, decades after the Copper Scroll had been sliced open, photographed, translated, retranslated, argued over, and quietly set back into its display case, the mystery of its language remained unsolved. Not in the sense that scholars couldn't read it. They could, more or less. The Hebrew was mostly clear, the letters sharply etched in their metallic grooves, legible across centuries, thanks to the durability of copper and the desert air. But clarity is not the same as certainty. Each sentence was a puzzle, in each translation, a theory. The language didn't refuse to speak, it simply declined to be specific. Take, for instance, the scroll's repetitive structure. The listings begin similarly in the ruin that is in the valley of Acre, under, then proceed with a location, a distance, a quantity. Often it reads like a warehouse manifest in the cistern of the courtyard, beneath the large stone. 9 talents of silver. It's almost clerical, precise, cold, but the more precisely it speaks, the more imprecise it becomes, because none of these locations have ever been firmly tied to a place on any known map. The scholars were left with numbers and nouns, but no verbs, no people, no story. It was as if they were reading the inventory from the end of a forgotten book, one whose pages had burned, leaving behind only the account ledger. And it is here that the scroll becomes more than a mystery. It becomes a mirror, one that reflects not what the past was, but how much of it we've lost. The scroll with no context. Imagine for a moment that you're an archivist in the far future. You come across a printed list in a burned library. It says, only in locker 1 to a third-floor basement, beneath broken vending machine, 4 boxes of coins, behind panel in staff room B, below emergency lamp, 2 duffel bags of paper, under second-floor stairwell at the western end, 3 sealed crates, labeled, now. Imagine the building is gone. The city it stood in has changed its name. The concept of a vending machine no longer exists, and the word duffel bag appears nowhere else in your archive. This is the experience of the copper scroll scholars. The text refers to ruins that may have already been ruins in its own time. Many descriptions seem tied to physical landmarks, stones, terraces, walls, but which stones? Which terraces? Which direction is north in a landscape where magnetic compasses didn't yet exist? Worse still, the scroll is utterly devoid of explanation. It does not say who wrote it, or why, or when. There are no introductions, no caliphans, teens, no seals, or names, or temple markings. It's as if it was meant to be untraceable. Some have suggested that it was written quickly by a single person, perhaps even dictated. Others argue the opposite, that the unusual Hebrew, the idiosyncratic spellings, and the systematic listing point to a carefully prepared official document. One meant for trusted eyes only, but trusted by whom? And why copper? The weight of copper was a rare choice for ancient writing. Most scrolls, biblical, commercial, or legal, were penned on parchment, leather, or papyrus. Easy to fold, it's easy to store, it's easy to destroy. But copper endures, which is precisely the point. If someone wanted to preserve a record for centuries, or for an unknown future, it made sense to carve it into metal, not for convenience, for permanence. The copper scroll, then, may not have been written for contemporaries. It may have been addressed to a future audience, perhaps one that knew nothing of the geography or politics of the moment. A kind of time capsule, written in a language that would soon die out, listing places that would vanish, guarded only by the weight of metal and time. Its survival, then, was not accidental. It was a plan. Theories wrapped in dust over the years. Theories have multiplied, not just among scholars, but among amateur historians, adventurers, theologians, and mystics. Some say the treasures listed belonged to the temple in Jerusalem. Others argue they were hidden by rebel priests during the First Jewish-Roman War, meant to be recovered after the Messiah returned. Some believe the scroll was a decoy, a trick to confuse Roman looters. Others suggest it was a coded text, one that needs a cipher, lost to time. One theory, proposed in the early 2000s by a former investigator named Jim Barfield, claimed that the scroll was entirely literal and mapped to known locations around Qumran. He used aerial photography, topographic analysis, and deep reading of the Hebrew to pinpoint several locations. Barfield's team conducted exploratory digs. They found nothing. Some say he wasn't allowed to dig deep enough. Others claimed the treasure was moved long ago, or that it never existed. The Israeli Antiquities Authority has remained cautious. Too many looters, too many false hopes, too much mystery. Language as burial to understand the copper scroll fully. One must see it not only as a document, but as a burial, not of treasure, but of knowledge. The scroll buries information in layers of ambiguity. The language is not false, but unhelpful. Instructions are not wrong, but unusable. Even the terms for measurement talents, cubits, hens, have multiple interpretations. You begin to see that the scroll may not be hiding gold. It may be hiding something older, a fear, warning, or simply pause to one ending. It's possible the author knew the temple was doomed, that its wealth, spiritual or material, was under threat. And rather than allow it to be stolen, they decided to write it down, lock it inside metal, let time decide what would be found. They didn't leave keys, only clues. Clues in a dying language. On a medium few could open, viewed a cave far from safety. The last words of a vanishing world many. Scholars believe the copper scroll was deposited around the time of the First Jewish-Roman War, 673 CE, a time of chaos, siege, betrayal. The temple was destroyed in 70 CE, Jerusalem burned, entire communities were scattered. If the scroll was placed in Cave 3 near Qumran during this period, it may have been the last effort of a crumbling priesthood, not to preserve wealth, but to preserve the idea of order, of memory. A list, then, becomes a form of resistance. The final line of the copper scroll reads, "In the hollow of the cistern's rim, 600 talents of silver," hidden and sealed with the name, and then it stops. The sentence breaks off. The scroll ends. There is no name. Some have speculated that the scroll was never finished, or that the final name was deliberately withheld, or that the scroll's author died before they could complete it. But whatever the case, the silence after that line is deafening. It suggests not just a forgotten language, but a forgotten person, someone who etched each letter, not knowing if anyone would ever read them. The work of remembering to this day. The copper scroll sits in the Jordan Museum in Amman. Its pieces, now mounted on metal frames, are displayed under soft lights. Scholars visit occasionally, but few new breakthroughs emerge. There are still no discovered treasures, no unlocked meanings, no consensus, and yet it endures, because sometimes the purpose of a text is not to reveal, but to persist, to be the one voice that remains when others vanish. And maybe that's all the copper scroll ever wanted, not to point the way to gold, but to remind the future that someone once thought the past was worth remembering, even if the words go unread, even if the map leads nowhere, even if silence is the only answer we ever find. You can hear it before you see it. The wind slipping through the broken rock like a whisper through teeth. Dry, warm, and ancient. It echoes down the cliffs of Qumran like the breath of something older than any scroll, older than any memory, older even than the name Judea. Hey, and then there is the silence. Once the wind stills just briefly, you are left with a soundless landscape, a pale desert under a pale sky. The Dead Sea shimmers to the east like melted glass, and the cliffs above hold secrets that no longer know they are secrets. There is no signpost pointing the way to Cave 3. No fence, no warning, just a fissure in the rock that widens as you approach, till the entrance opens like a wound. It was here, in 1952, that Bedouin shepherds and a team of archaeologists pried open a strange scroll, made not of papyrus or parchment, but of copper. That story has been told many times, but what has not been told what remains buried beneath layers of rock. Silt, gaswork, and fears, the question of what still lies beyond that scroll. What else remains hidden in Qumran? Why has no one ever found it? The archaeologists who turned back in the early 1950s. When the copper scroll was discovered, it was already badly damaged, corroded shut, rolled into a tight spiral so hardened by oxidation that it could not be unrolled without breaking. Eventually, the scroll was sent to Manchester, England, where it was cut into 23 strips with a tiny saw and then photographed and studied. But what is less often remembered is what happened before it was moved. What the archaeologists did not take. Not the cave where the scroll was found. Cave 3's narrow, damp, and uneven. Unlike some of the earlier Qumran caves, which had clear signs of habitation or multiple scroll jars, Cave 3 was different. It was dry but irregular. No sleeping spaces, no living quarters. Tight passage leading to a strange stone niche, and the scroll, stuck in a crack in the wall. It wasn't discovered in a jar like the others. It was jammed into place, as if hidden in haste. But here's the detail many forget. Reports from the 1950s mention a partially sealed wall deeper inside the cave. Just a few meters beyond where the scroll was found, one archaeologist noted the remains of a collapsed chamber stones laid in a suspiciously structured fashion, as if part of a doorway or partition. They recorded it, took some photos, but they did not excavate it. The reason, officially, was that resources were limited and that the copper scroll itself was the priority. Unofficially, some say they feared collapsing the cave entirely. Either way, the rocks were left in place. The chamber was never opened, and for 70 years, that decision has gone unexamined. The myth of the final room among fringe researchers and amateur historians. The idea of a final chamber beyond Cave 3 has become a kind of legend. They call it the last room, the place no one wanted to dig. It's a spot that may or may not contain what the scroll described. But even without conspiracies, even without treasure fantasies, there remains a quiet question. Why was the copper scroll placed there? If the contents were so valuable, why hide it in a shallow fissure only a few feet from open air? Why not bury it? Why not seal it deeper? Unless, of course, the scroll wasn't a treasure at all. Unless it was a key or an index pointing the way to a larger archive hidden nearby. Scholars rarely speculate on this. The field is cautious, grounded in material evidence. But some, quietly, have admitted what many suspect. Qumran may still have secrets. The problem is, we stopped looking. The landscape that changes without changing the cliffs of Qumran are always shifting. Not dramatically, but slowly, with time and weather. Widens here. A ledge collapses there. Erosion eats at the ancient limestone like an invisible sculptor, revealing cavities, sealing others. In the decades since the original excavations, more than a dozen minor fissures and hidden chambers have been spotted in the hills surrounding the original caves. Some were too small to explore. Others were partially collapsed. None yielded scrolls, but not all have been fully examined. In fact, many scholars believe only a small portion of the area around Qumran has been systematically mapped using modern techniques. A 2017 effort by the Israel Antiquities Authority used drones and high-resolution imaging to identify more than 50 new cave-like formations in a nearby zone. The archaeologists found jars, pottery shards, even a few parchment fragments, but nothing like the scrolls, nothing like copper. Still, it reignited the question. If one scroll made of metal survived left undisturbed for 2,000 years, why not more? Why have we not found them? The silence of bureaucracy. Part of the answer lies not in the caves, but in the offices that oversee them. Archaeology in the region is sensitive. The Qumran site is in the West Bank, near the border with Jordan, in an area filled with political, religious, and territorial complexity. Excavation permits are difficult to obtain. International teams must coordinate with multiple agencies, often with conflicting interests. Even within the archaeological community, there is disagreement. Some believe the Qumran caves were simply part of a local monastic settlement. Others think they were hiding places for Jerusalem's priests during war. Some say the scrolls are sectarian, others say national, and some quietly suggest that the full truth might never be known, not because it is unknowable, but because no one wants to ask the question too loudly. Meanwhile, the caves wait. A place of dust and Keys Cave 3 remains open. It is sometimes visited, sometimes ignored. Its path is not lit. Its floor is not stable. But anyone who has stood inside will tell you the same thing. It feels unfinished, like something was left behind. Not treasure, not gold or silver, but something else. a silence that is not empty, but expectant. One archaeologist once described it as a place built to hold a key that was never returned. And maybe that's the simplest truth. Maybe what remains hidden in Qumran is not a secret scroll, or a vault of riches, or a buried temple archive. Maybe it's the knowledge that something should be there, that something was meant to be found, and that we stopped looking just before we reached it. If you stand in Cave 3 long enough, the light changes around you. It's not dramatic. There's no beam from heaven, no crack in the rock glowing with promise. But as the sun shifts over the Dead Sea and shadows deepen along the jagged walls, a quiet impression settles in. It feels like a hallway unfinished, half-blocked, as if someone started building something and stopped before they could close the door. Kinda. That's how some archaeologists described it in the 1950s. A space that looked like it had been interrupted at the end of the narrow corridor where the copper scroll was found wedged in a fissure. There was a small stack of stones, seemingly random, but too tight and too deliberate to be a simple collapse. Some thought it might be a structural partition. Others called it natural debris. It was never fully excavated. But what was left unsaid in the field reports remains the most compelling part. The orientation of those stones matched other structural patterns found in known Qumran installations, door frames, retaining walls, collapsed thresholds. What might have been just rock might have been a sealed entry, and no one has looked again. The records we forgot to keep in the years following the discovery of the copper scroll. Dozens of international scholars passed through Qumran. Many came focused only on texts. Few were interested in the rocks, even fewer in the spaces between the finds. But in the archives of the École Biblique in Jerusalem, one can still find the field sketches of French archaeologist Roland de Vaux. His ink lines are spare, methodical, and outline of the terrain. It's a sequence of excavation, and in the bottom corner, it's a hesitant sketch, a slightly sloped passage in Cave 3, marked with a dotted question. The caption beneath reads, simply, possible, sealed chamber. De Vaux never investigated it further. The copper scroll itself had become the obsession, and the team moved quickly to remove it from the cave and transport it for analysis abroad. Meanwhile, the cave itself was left as it was, disturbed, partially mapped, but incomplete. What strikes modern researchers is the absence of further attempts. In the decades since, Cave 3 has never been fully re-excavated. No one has returned to remove the stones. No one has tested the soil behind the partition. And yet, this isn't negligence. It is something more complicated. It is tension, the fear of not finding to understand why the stones remain undisturbed. One must understand the culture of archaeological risk in a site as sensitive and mythologized as Qumran. Every dig becomes a statement. Every trench is a declaration of belief about the Essenes, about Second Temple Judaism, about the role of Qumran in preserving history. And sometimes, not digging is safer than digging and finding nothing. Because what if there is no chamber? What if there is no vault? What if there is no truth waiting to be uncovered? An absence can unsettle more than an ambiguity. For decades, that silent logic prevailed. It was easier to leave Cave 3 as a site of potential than to risk reducing it to just another dusty, hollow dot. And so the rocks stayed clues in the scroll itself. But the copper scroll has not been quiet in the years since it was cut and studied. New technologies, multispectral analysis, linguistic retranslation have slowly peeled back its secrets. Most scholars now agree the scroll is not poetry. It is not apocalyptic prophecy like the other Dead Sea texts. It is a list, 64 entries. Each describes a cache of treasure measured in talents, cubits, in weights of gold, silver, or vessels hidden beneath cisterns, behind millstones, inside aqueducts, or under mounds of ash. Most are maddeningly vague. In the ruin that lies in the valley of Acre, or at the place of the olives beneath the third step. But one entry stands out. Line 5-6. It mentions a duplicate copy of the scrollberry in a separate location for safekeeping. Scholars have long debated this. Was it real or just rhetorical? But if the copper scroll was a key, where was the second copy hidden? Some believe that second scroll was in the same chamber in Cave 3, just beyond the stones, never retrieved, never moved, perhaps even destroyed by moisture, or time, or a quiet collapse that sealed the tunnel just days after it was hidden. And so we are left with a single half of a message. The rest dissolved into silence. Soundings that never happened in modern archaeology. Geophysical methods are often used before excavation. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic surveys, Qumran has had only limited surveys of this kind. A 1996 report noted that only 15% of the immediate area had been imaged using subsurface scans. Budget constraints, political complications, and access restrictions have limited deeper investigations. But the cave remains. A 2009 proposal by a team from the Hebrew University aimed to use microdrone mapping and LiDAR to chart the inner topography of Cave 3 in 3 dimensions, hoping to detect hidden cavities or sealed spaces beyond the visible rock. The proposal was not funded, but one note in the grant submission lingers. It is likely that the so-called blocked corridor represents an unfinished extension or a concealed space. Current technology would allow mapping it without disturbance. In other words, we could look. We simply haven't. What might still be there if the sealed stones do conceal a space? What might it contain? Not gold, not the temple treasures, but perhaps something more enduring. A cache of duplicate documents, right, not in copper, or leather, or linen-wrapped scrolls, now reduced to fragments. A commentary, a record of those who wrote the copper scroll, a scribal workshop, a hidden archive, or perhaps just emptiness. A small, unfinished chamber, a storeroom, never used. A dead end, but even then, the emptiness would speak. It would tell you something about what the scroll meant, not just its contents, but its context. Was it isolated, or part of a larger set? Was it ceremonial, or practical? Was it hidden in panic, or planned with intent? We cannot know until we return to the rocks. No one moved. Time's quiet pressure, the stones have not changed. But the cave around them has. Moisture seeps in. Insects nest in the crevices. Dust falls in quiet layers. Every year that passes, the material record degrades. In the end, it may be silence that claims the last word, not secrecy, not design. The final chamber may not be waiting to be found. It may already be gone. But then, again, history often turns on moments no one noticed. A crack widened. A wall gave way. A corner turned not by scholars, but by wind, or time, or some wandering eye. And when that moment comes, perhaps not today, or this decade, or even this century, someone might stand again in Cave 3 and look not at what was found, but at what was left behind. If the story of the copper scroll is a map, then its final location, wedged silently in Cave 3, was not just a place, but a conclusion, a decision, a final act in an unwritten drama whose players remain unknown. In the cave itself, with its scattered tools, collapsed walls, and one unmoved pile of stones, became a kind of period at the end of a vanishing sentence. But sometimes, silence writes its own language. When archaeologists left Cave 3 in 1952, they believed they had uncovered the most tangible artifact in the Dead Sea Scroll discovery. A scroll that wasn't scroll, a text that wasn't spiritual, a list of treasures that weren't there. But what they didn't say in their reports, and perhaps didn't want to admit, even to themselves, was that they had also left behind something else. A question. possibility that the cave itself hadn't finished its story. Why the chamber remained unopened in the world of archaeology. Decisions are rarely just scientific. They are political, theological, logistical. Qumran, by the early 1960s, had become a battlefield not of weapons, but of interpretations. Some argued the site was an Essene settlement, a monastic library, a scribal outpost. Others believed it had nothing to do with the Essenes, that it was a fortress, a villa, or even a pottery production site. Every theory colored how future digs were planned or, more often, how they weren't. Cave 3 became a footnote, to contest it, to attract funding, to dry up further scrolls, to entice sensationalist press, and too ambiguous to support any one scholarly camp. And so it was left, not out of carelessness, but out of fatigue. The grand excitement of Qumran had faded. The world had moved on. And in that movement, the pile of stones blocking the suspected chamber simply became part of the background. Mute fixture in a cave that no longer drew cameras or conferences. The echoes of other sites and yet, elsewhere, similar stories unfolded in Egypt. The tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun was discovered, sealed behind an undecorated plaster wall. For years, it was believed the burial chamber was modest until a hidden room was uncovered behind the wall in 2015 using radar. In Turkey, at Daring Q, entire underground cities remained untouched beneath villages for centuries till a collapsed floor revealed tunnel mouths leading to miles of ancient chambers. Even in Jerusalem, the city of David, excavations continue to reveal spaces that were long dismissed by early scholars as unimportant or unreachable. Time has a way of forgiving past disinterest. It also has a way of erasing second chances. The Copper Scroll's final lines, the final lines of the Copper Scroll are incomplete. The last entry ends abruptly in the cave of the column with two openings facing east, and then nothing, no verb, no object, no mention of what was buried, no measurement, no weight. It's the beginning of a sentence that never finishes. Some scholars believe the scroll was damage corroded beyond legibility. Others think the scribe was interrupted, or that the scroll was a draft, a preparatory copy, never finalized. But there is a third theory, that the scroll was never meant to end, that its final line, cueing vaguely to a cave with two openings, possibly cave 3 itself, was not a conclusion, but a gesture, a finger pointing toward what was still to be discovered. And if that is true, then the story of Qumran's final chamber is not about gold or silver or temple relics hidden from the Romans. It is about a message, a deliberate burial of potential, not of treasure, but of truth. The invisible guards, the scroll's creators, were likely Essene scribes, deeply religious, meticulously methodical, and conscious of time, purity, and secrecy. For them, the act of writing was sacred. The act of hiding was strategic, and the act of waiting for the right moment, the right audience, the right reader, was perhaps the most important of all. It's possible that the chamber behind the stones was never meant to be found by the Romans, or by the next generation, or by any generation, until the temple was rebuilt, until exile ended, until divine restoration began. To them, time was not linear, it was sacred rhythm. Revelation would come, not when curiosity peaked, but when providence permitted. In that sense, the final chamber, sealed, silent, unmoving, became less a hiding place and more a liturgy, a ritual, a physical prayer left unanswered. The modern, delimited day, Cave 3 lies just off the main tourist trail in Qumran. Visitors rarely go there. The path is unmarked. The entrance is weather-worn. Dust has settled into every crevice, and lizards dart through shadows that once hid scrolls. but the stones are still there. Archaeologists know this. So do historians. So do the guards who patrol the site. Some whisper about renewed efforts to excavate. Others caution against it. The debate continues in silence. To disturb the cave now would require permits, security, and above all funding, and without clear guarantees of what lies beyond the stones. Interest remains sporadic, because how do you convince the world to fund a maybe? The final irony in the end, perhaps the greatest irony of the Copper Scroll, is this. It is the only scroll not written on parchment. Yet, it is the only one to survive time without disintegration. It is the only scroll that offers material promises, treasure, vessels, gold, and yet it has yielded no proof of those promises. It is the scroll that points most clearly to something lost, and yet gives us no way to find it. And its cave, Cave 3, may hold the only key to that paradox. Or it may hold nothing, but even that would be an answer. What the silence leaves behind, there are a few certainties in history. Most stories fade before they finish. Most truths lie in half-buried whispers, in eroded tablets, in worn staircases that led nowhere. But some absences leave stronger marks than presences. The sealed chamber in Qumran, whether it is real or imagined, continues to shape how we think about hidden history, not because of what it offers, but because of what it withholds. In that sense, it mirrors the Copper Scroll itself, a text that isn't a story, a message that may never be received, a map that leads us back to the beginning, back to the cave, back to the rocks. No one moved, and so the question lingers long after the scholars have gone, long after the scroll has been locked behind museum glass, long after the footsteps in the desert have blown away with the dust. What did they hide behind that final wall? Tia, why has no one dared to see? Asterisk good night. ...